Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Your Excellency, President Uhuru Kenyatta, honorable ministers on both countries and cabinet secretaries, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, allow me, Mr. President, to start by extending my sincere gratitude to you for inviting us to visit this beautiful country. I thank you for your warm welcome and the hospitality extended to my delegation since our arrival. I concur fully with the remarks by President Kenyatta. Indeed, we have just concluded our discussions, which were quite fruitful and productive. In our deliberations, we reviewed a wide range of bilateral, regional, and international issues of mutual interest. The cooperation between our two countries spans across a number of fields, and today we have taken these relations to a higher level. We see a lot of room for the further expansion of our relations. Over the years, there has been remarkable increase in economic relations between our two countries, as demonstrated by the large number of the South African companies operating in Kenya. To date, over 60 South African companies are doing business here. Trade cooperation continues to show an upward mobility, thus making Kenya one of South Africa's top trading partners on the continent. We will later today interact, as His Excellency has said, with the South Africa-Kenya Business Forum and encourage further economic cooperation between the two sides. We have also agreed to create an enabling environment to ease the manner of doing business in our respective countries. The tripartite free trade area covering COMESA, East African Community, and Southern African Development Community is one of the practical initiatives taken by governments to facilitate trade and investment in the continent, consistent with our determined effort to implement the African Union Agenda 2063 and its plan of action. Your Excellency, we welcome the signing of new bilateral agreements today. The signing of these instruments is a clear indication of our collective determination to take our relations to a higher level. We are indeed working towards a strategic partnership anchored on economic and security cooperation. With regard to international developments, we discussed issues related to peace and security in the continent. We have noted with great concern the challenges posed by terrorism and extremist groups that continue to affect some of our countries on the continent. We condemn in the strongest possible terms all forms of terrorism and extremism. We reiterate the need for joint regional and continental efforts towards countering these negative elements. Ladies and gentlemen, since we are in East Africa, it was only natural that we spend considerable time discussing the current challenges in Burundi, South Sudan, and Somalia. We expressed our grave concern about the ongoing conflicts in these sister countries, which affect the entire region. We urge the government of Burundi and people of Burundi to speed up the national dialogue, to step up the national dialogue process under the stewardship of the East African community. We condemn the recent call by the SPLM in opposition under Dr. Riek Machar for a popular armed resistance against the government in Juba. There is absolutely no need for fighting. Further fighting will only exacerbate the human suffering in South Sudan. We call on Dr. Riek Machar to return to Juba and participate in the transitional government. On the DRC, we urge all stakeholders to participate in the national dialogue process. We hope that the dialogue will come up with a clear roadmap towards elections. Considering our commitment to finding African solutions to the African problems, we have agreed to work together to deal with these challenges. Ladies and gentlemen, we concluded our discussions by reiterating our common position on the need to reform the multilateral institutions, including the United Nations Security Council, to better represent the interests of the developing world. We are happy and satisfied that this visit has indeed taken relations between South Africa and Kenya to a much higher level. We look forward to increased and cheaper cooperation, friendship, and solidarity between the two nations. I thank you, Your Excellency.
Thank you. The Excellencies will take one or two questions. Let's start with Chemtai Goin.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Like the State House spokesman said, my name is Chemtai Goin. My first question will go to the President Uhuru Kenyatta. Security is a big challenge here in Kenya, and especially the threat of terror is very real. I know you've spoken about cybersecurity and what agreements you'll have with South Africa, but what direct benefit is Kenya getting from this visit by the South African president? And to you, the South African president, South Africa and largely most of the SADC countries are seen to be not accessible to other African countries. What commitment do you give to resolving the visa issue and particularly just making South Africa accessible to enhance trade and business relations? Thank you.
Let me begin with the issue that you've raised on terrorism. And as I have said severally, and it's clear, terrorism is not a Kenyan phenomenon. This is a global phenomenon that is affecting all corners and all parts of the globe. And therefore, the only true way to deal with this threat is for nations to work together, to plan together in order to root out terrorism and also to be able to deal with radicalized groups and also working together to prepare de-radicalization plans also and how to integrate these young men and women who have been poisoned by false ideology to go into some of these extremist type of issues. So therefore, the cooperation between Kenya and South Africa is largely related towards sharing intelligence, is related towards identifying sources of funding, terrorist sources of funding. We need to be able to work together in that endeavor, is to enhance counter-terrorism activities and how we can partner both in training and in exchanging experiences, but also in working together to stabilize some of the countries where terrorism takes root because there is no stable governments, such as Somalia. So our ability to work together also in Somalia and the peacekeeping efforts and the efforts that we are putting into trying to push Somalia into a direction where they can have stable governments, helping them also improve their own internal security capacity so that they can manage the security situation in their countries so that they are no longer havens of terrorism. These are amongst the areas of cooperation that we seek to work together with our brothers and sisters in South Africa. I believe the next question was for you.
Thank you, Excellency. Well, thank you very much for the question as well. You will also, if I start from the continental position, the leaders in the continent have realized that the history of colonialism divided us without our agreement into the kind of countries and regions we have. And therefore, there is a broader agenda of the AU to soften the borders in the continent so that we could enhance or create a fertile ground for intra-trade. Because without intra-trade, we have realized we cannot develop as a continent. All other regions in the form of continents, they are able to thrive because there is quick movement of goods and people. So there is that general backdrop of the continent. We are also moving to integrate the 5 regions which are economic regions of the continent. 3 have moved very far, which include the regions where the 2 countries are situated. The 2 are in the process of coming in. That in itself indicates that the issue of hard borders and the problem of visas is being attended to by all in the continent. And of course, the point you are focusing on is that before we reach that stage, there are relations between countries like Kenya and South Africa. And that issue has featured in our discussion of how do we move forward between the 2 countries to allow the movement of goods and people to happen. Of course, we have to deal with a lot of things that the president called obstacles that we need to remove because we can't do it at a go. There are already steps that have been taken to people of specific categories who must not have problems to come into South Africa, etc. And we discussed some of the issues that need to be considered very thoroughly to allow that process to come in. You know that both countries, South Africa and Kenya, has a lot of foreigners who are in these two countries, some of whom could use that possibility for not good reasons. And therefore, those are matters that need to be looked at as we move forward. And we must find solutions to those issues so that we move ahead with what Africa has agreed, that we should soften our borders, have interrelations and intertrade unhindered by the kind of borders that were created by our colonialists. So the matter is receiving attention. Thank you.
Yeah, next, Sarah Kimani, SABC.
Good afternoon, Excellencies. My name is Sarah Kimani. I work for the South African Broadcasting, based here in Nairobi. I wanted to find out, you've specifically stated a few issues of trade barriers and non-trade barriers that must be removed so that the trade imbalance between the two economic powerhouses can move forward. What are the timelines you're looking for? Take, for example, if it's tea moving into South Africa to be duty-free, if it's soda ash, and if it's for South Africa, for Kenyans to be able to access visas on arrival. Secondly, there is a report stating that both Kenya and South Africa are housing some of these South Sudan dissidents, or their homes or their families. And that is one of the reasons why they are able to continue carrying out insurgency or calling out for war, because they are comfortable and their families are comfortable here. As the two mediators and guarantors of the peace agreement in South Sudan, would you be willing to freeze the assets of these leaders, if only to move the South Sudanese peace process forward? And finally, you both have the demographic dividend, which is the youth. The African youth is very restless. We've seen what is happening in South Africa right now with the university students calling for the fees must fall. Both leaders, did you discuss what to do to be able to deal with the situation of the youth on the continent, to ensure that what you agree today, they're also involved? And President Zuma, specifically to you, would you be willing to sit down with church leaders, students, and parents who have called for a meeting to be able to deal with the university school fees issue? Thank you very much.
I don't know how many questions those were, but there's definitely not one.
I realized two. They were packed into one, but quite a number of them. Well, thank you very much for the question. Now, firstly, as we indicated with the question of the visas, that is the matter in progress, which is being worked on by the two countries, taking into account the issues I raised, which need to be considered, to be worked on, so that when we reach the final understanding, there are no loopholes that will be used by wrong people who might use that kind of opening for their own kind of reasons. So the matter is being attended to. We have also given instruction to our ministers and officials to work hard in removing any obstacle that is limiting the growth of the trade between the two countries. We have realized, for an example, that it is not at the same level. There is more goods moving in one direction, and we need to find ways and means to balance that. It is fair and possible for us to do so, to therefore identify the specific areas that we need to deal with. I'm sure you heard His Excellency the President Kenyatta indicating that Kenya has a young population. That is exactly the same in South Africa. South Africa has a young population. But not just these two countries. It is also admitted by the globe that Africa, as Africa, has a young population. That means we need, therefore, to move with the youth, to be innovative, to engage with the youth. And we are engaging with the youth, indeed. As you say, for an example, in South Africa, there is a current protest that is undertaken by the students. What is the protest about? They need free education. They want education to be free. But of course, that goes with the history of that country. Because historically, when we still had the apartheid system, education was indeed a weapon that was used by the oppressors to deprive the black majority of quality education. And therefore, by the time we reached our freedom, this is one of the backlogs that we are dealing with. And we have made it a priority number one to invest in, and that's what we are doing. This is also in keeping with the policies of the ruling party, which it developed way back during the struggle, that precisely because of the position of education in our country, you needed, when South Africa is free, to address the question of education, and that doors of learning must be opened, and that government must give bursaries to poor kind of students who come from poor families and those who will be orphans, etc. They must receive education free of charge. That statement was very clear, because we're not saying during freedom time, everybody must receive a free education, even if the parents can afford, because we've got to balance the resources. What we have done already, ever since 1994, the students at primary up to higher education coming from poor families, in fact, there are schools where fees are no longer paid, to implement that policy. So we are in the process of implementing it. In fact, it is about 80% of the poor kids who go to school without paying, up to what you call here, we call it matric there. Here you call it A. Yes.
KCSE.
That's correct. That is an implementation of the policy towards free education. With regard to poor children that go to tertiary institutions, we have a fund which we call NSFAS, which is a scheme to pay at that level for the poor schools. We have in fact developed it instead of a loan. If students perform very well towards the end, it is turned into a grant. So we are implementing that policy. What has happened in South Africa is that the students, since last year, started protesting against raising of the fees by the universities. That was the first thing, I'm sure. You being a journalist, you know it better. They started by shouting a slogan, hashtag, the rise of fees must fall. Saying it, of course, differently. That was the issue. But once they were protesting very vigorously, we had a meeting with them and the leadership of the tertiary institutions, and therefore agreed that at the beginning of this year, there will be no rise in the fees. And government took the responsibility to address that issue, because if there were no rise, it meant that government must take the responsibility to pay for that. This year, again, they raised the matter and went to protest as they are protesting now, demanding free education. Of course, if you take it from what they're saying and the manner in which they're saying it, and I'm happy you said the youth is vibrant, the vibrancy must also be responsible. Can't just have vibrancy that borders to irresponsibility. The very fact that poor students are being catered for at the tertiary institutions, you can then not distinguish between those who must pay and those who cannot pay, therefore that government must pay for. That's a matter that is being debated, and the students at the moment are saying we cannot stop protesting until government accepts that education must be free with no qualification. Fortunately, a few weeks ago, the ruling party made a clear policy statement on this matter, as it is the party that emerged with the policy of free education, what it means. And this is what is being debated by everybody. And of course, the meetings that are being asked by the churches, by other groupings, we are honoring them. We are discussing those matters with them, and we hope that we will be able to solve those kind of problems. We are committed as a government, but as we explain it, to address the question of the poor and the working class, because it will be very difficult to pay as a government for a child of a parent who has every means to pay. It would not make sense. And I don't think there is any government in anywhere in the world we should do so. We who have the means must support the system for the benefit of the country. That's what we are saying. That's our position, and that's what we are engaging the youth on. Thank you.